Welcome back. Today we're diving into a really fascinating analysis of Barack Obama's legacy, looking at the Nobel Prize, the pivot to Asia, and that central paradox of his presidency.
Yeah, the big question. A super successful policy agenda, but at the same time, huge political losses for the Democratic Party.
Exactly. How can a president pass the Affordable Care Act, rebuild the economy, and still oversee the loss of over 1,000 Democratic seats? It feels like the core tension of the whole piece.
It is. And I think to make the analysis even stronger, the critique will gain a lot of structural clarity by shifting how we view that paradox. So, not looking at policy success and political failure as two separate outcomes.
Okay, not as two things happening in parallel.
Right. We need to identify how the policy choices themselves actually created the political vulnerability.
So you're looking for causation, not just correlation.
Exactly. The piece already touches on this. It highlights Obama's preference for what's been called subterranean state building.
Right, these complex regulatory frameworks that are hard for the average person to see.
They were brilliant for getting policy done, but they made it almost impossible for the Democratic Party to claim visible credit, to mobilize people around the wins.
But hold on, wasn't that the point? Wasn't that kind of low visibility necessary to get something huge like Dodd-Frank or even the stimulus through such a polarized environment? You could argue that's a feature, not a bug.
It was a feature for the short-term win, absolutely, but it turned out to be a catastrophic bug for the party's long-term health. So the suggestion here is to strengthen the argument by explicitly saying that the design of those policies, that design directly contributed to the fragility of the party.
That's a much bigger claim. It moves the argument from just they had bad messaging to the policy itself was designed with a political flaw.
Precisely. Let's take the economic stimulus, the ARA, a concrete example. Instead of just saying it was successful but invisible, we should emphasize how it was designed so people would, quote, not notice a thing, and how that decision took away the public's ability to credit the Democrats. Where were the signs on the construction projects?
I see. So by prioritizing speed and maybe subtlety, they lost the political gratitude that should have come with it.
They healed the economy without generating political momentum. And you can apply the same logic to financial reform.
To Dodd-Frank.
Yeah. Dodd-Frank provided a framework for governance, not a set of, hard, visible rules a voter could understand. That flexibility helped get it passed, sure, but it also made the reforms politically vulnerable.
Because there weren't tangible benefits for people to rally around and protect.
Exactly. The law was, in a way, disposable. You can't compare it to something like Social Security, where the benefit is simple, direct, and very, very visible. Obama's success was complex, and the political cost of that complexity was, ironically, simplicity itself.
So the policy strength, its regulatory depth, became its critical political weakness. We can draw a straight line from the design of the policy right to the Senate losses.
That's the structural link. That's what we need to see.
Okay, that lack of a clear, immediate win for the public, it brings us right to the next big point, which is the 2009 Nobel Peace Prize. The material makes a really strong case that it was wholly undeserving.
It does, and the analogy it uses is great. The one about the NCAA athlete praised for extraordinary efforts but no actual accomplishments yet.
It's a sharp image.
It is, but to make this section truly robust, we have to formally acknowledge and then rebut the main counterargument from his supporters.
Which is the whole Pax Americana idea.
Exactly. The current weakness is that the critique focuses so much on the lack of immediate achievement that it sort of ignores this really powerful counter-narrative, which is that the prize is often symbolic, it's political.
And the argument is that just by having Obama normalize U.S. diplomacy, the world's biggest power, that alone contributes to a kind of Pax America, a reduction in conflict.
Right. We need to tackle the strongest version of that claim head-on. So, introduce the idea that the Pax America argument basically says that just getting the elephant in the room, America, to play nice is in itself a huge step for global peace.
And that the prize committee saw the award as a tool, as a way to influence future actions, not just reward past ones.
Yes, and if you accept that premise, it changes the entire debate. The core thesis has to evolve. If we just say it was undeserved, we're kind of missing that whole geopolitical game.
So the critique needs to shift. It's not just about what he had or hadn't done by December 2009.
Precisely. It should move from undeserved to something more like premature or maybe overtly political, especially when you look at the long game of influence. A good way to do this is to draw parallels to other controversial winners.
Like Teddy Roosevelt or Henry Kissinger.
Exactly. Both got the award despite, very controversial foreign policy actions. Framing it that way shows Obama's award wasn't some bizarre mistake, but part of a sort of recurring tradition of the committee recognizing potential or symbolic power.
So it grounds the critique in a historical context, rather than just seeming like outrage.
Right. It makes the argument deeper. You acknowledge their reasoning, but you can still conclude that the award was flawed, just based on a more sophisticated metric.
Okay, let's shift gears now to foreign policy itself. The analysis of the pivot to Asia is very thorough as a strategic move, but I think we can use that concept of a pivot to do more work for the narrative.
I completely agree. We should think about elevating pivot from just a foreign policy term to a symbolic motif for his entire life and career.
Right now, it feels like the geopolitical pivot to Asia is walled off from his personal story. And that feels like a missed opportunity.
A huge one. I mean, think about his life. His decision to leave a corporate job to become a community organizer in Chicago, that was a massive pivot.
Or what he wrote about that moment in his early 20s, after his father died, when he decided to get real strict about my life. Another huge personal pivot.
Yes. And the risk is that by only focusing on the policy, moving ships and troops, we overlook how this idea reflects a deeper pattern in his own decision-making. The word itself, pivot, has this dual nature, personal reorientation and strategic shift.
So how do you connect a personal choice he made at age 20 with, say, a geopolitical strategy to counterbalance China?
Well, they share the same core mechanism, don't they? It's a measured, cautious, calculated reorientation of priorities. It's about allocating scarce resources, whether that resource is your own time and focus or the nation's military and capital.
That's interesting. It connects his personal style, that search for common ground he learned in Chicago, to his diplomatic goals in Asia.
He was trying to pivot without creating a crisis, and this isn't just a thematic link. It can have real causal weight in the analysis. For example, contrast that biggest pivot he made as a young man with the strategic pivot to Asia.
Okay.
You could argue that this personal tendency toward a very cautious, calculated recentering, maybe that helps explain the administration's biggest miscalculation.
Which was?
The failure to fully draw down from the Middle East. His caution led to overextension. The resources he needed for the pivot to Asia were still bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan long after they were supposed to be out.
So the failure to execute that first pivot from the Middle East ultimately crippled the second, more important one to Asia?
Exactly. The administration was trying to make two massive strategic shifts at once, with resources it just didn't have. So you can use the pivot motif to explain a huge structural failure of his foreign policy.
That's a really powerful way to bridge biography and international relations with a single idea. Okay, let's move to the last major point, the domestic analysis of race and inequality.
Right, and the material correctly notes that Obama taught complex legal theory, specifically topics rooted in what we now call critical race theory, or CRT.
Yeah, at the University of Chicago.
And that background needs to be leveraged much, much more deeply. To get a sharper analysis, any exploration of his policies on criminal justice and inequality has to be informed by the very legal concepts he himself taught.
At the moment, the piece covers things like reducing sentences for nonviolent drug offenses, but it sort of lands on this idea that his reforms were too cautious.
And too cautious is the weakness. It's a label, but it's not an explanation. And we can explain it using his own unique background. I mean, the source material says he taught concepts like racial gerrymandering, reparations, the whole debate over the meaning of merit.
These are radical structural critiques of American society, not just minor policy tweaks.
Exactly. So the suggestion is to frame the entire critique around the intellectual gap between the radical debates he was having in the classroom and the very pragmatic, very incremental policy steps he took in the White House.
I see. So that's the source of the perceived caution. It's a chasm, really. On one side, you have these huge theoretical ideas, like from Derek Bell on reparations or structural racism.
Ideas that question if you can ever fix racial discrimination without requiring whites to surrender aspects of their superior social status. I mean, that's a massive confrontational idea.
Right.
So contrast that deep intellectual engagement with the actual policy. For example, the policy was instructing U.S. attorneys to seek just and proportional sentences.
Which is incremental. It's practical. It's politically safe.
The critique is right there, in that contrast. You can assess his policy not just against what was politically possible, but against the maximalist intellectual framework he knew inside and out. That's how you explain why so many critics felt his efforts were frustratingly lost opportunities.
Because the reforms were so cautious relative to the intellectual stakes that he, more than anyone, understood.
It gives you a unique analytical hook that most other commentaries on his legacy just don't have. It explains that conflict between the academic critic he was and the pragmatic politician he had to be.
This is really strong. These are all significant, very actionable points for revision. So, to quickly recap the suggestions.
Go for it.
First, reframe that policy-political paradox as a single causal link. The policy's design created the political failure. Second, for the Nobel Prize, formalize and rebut the Pax Americana argument to shift the critique from simply undeserved to premature or overly political.
Third, use pivot as that unifying theme for his personal life and his geopolitics, connecting his cautious nature to the strategic misfire in Asia. And finally, use his academic background in CRT to sharpen the critique of his policies on race. Analyze that gap between the theory he taught and the incrementalism he practiced.
These are the kind of refinements that will make the analysis truly robust and, I think, original. We're genuinely excited to see how you weave these connections into the revised piece.
Absolutely. Take your time with it. Really focus on drawing out those causal lines. And please, send it back to us when you're ready. We'd love to take another look.